Greetings everyone, it is Zakes here. Welcome to our weekly videos, and this week we'll be talking about regulations. Let us first start by defining what they are, right? For the purposes of our discussion, and the legal technicalists should, forgive me for this, but regulations are laws that people who are involved in, economic activity or productive activity should follow. So you want to start a business, you want to offer a particular service or sell particular products. These are laws like safety and how to set up, even signage, right? These are things that the government passes, directives that the government passes and expects every business operator to follow. Let us make an example, because examples are always great, right, in understanding concepts like these. So in the food industry, if you're interested in selling a particular food item, you have to follow, regulations, directives from the state that tell you how to keep your kitchen as hygienic as possible, which chemicals to use, which chemicals not to use in the maintenance of that kitchen, right? Just as one typical example. So for anyone who wants to open a food business, outside of the cost of actually sourcing, the raw materials, the labor that will be required, and, all the means of production, of course, that are necessary for the production of food, you also have to factor in that those, for instance, equipment, right? Your equipment, you have to buy specific equipment that will follow the regulations of the state, because if you don't, you'd be in violation of the law. And in most cases that not, this increases the cost, because as I mentioned, this is something that you do not because you want to satisfy your customer, because it is not something that the customer wants. And I'll illustrate this in an example, but it is because it is something that the state wants. And this creates costs, right, for business owners who now not only have to consider consumer needs and preferences, but also have to consider statutory, jurisdictional state preferences in terms of what the government wants them to do. So as an example, I'm sure most of us have eaten fat cakes, right? I live in Johannesburg, and during winter we eat a lot of them, and most will attest that they buy fat cakes from, street hawkers. Street hawkers are people who sell food without following these health and safety regulations, right? About how hygienic a kitchen should be in the preparation of food. Yet they still have consumers like myself and, millions of others in this city alone that I can think of, and I'm sure in cities all across South Africa, that patronize them, right? So you have consumers who want a certain product. You have a seller in the form of a street trader who is willing to provide that certain product, and you have a third party in terms of the state that says that the product can only be provided under these conditions. Yet we see that when those conditions are not met, the two parties who are necessary for the commencement or for the operation of a commercial contract are still happy with it, right? The consumer and the seller. Me as a consumer, I've never had a problem. In most cases they're not, right? There have been cases where I've found the general environment to not be palatable for the consumption of food, but, and this is the great thing about the market, I've chosen not to patronize those businesses. But there are others that, even though they don't follow the prescripts of health and safety regulations to the T, I've still chosen to patronize them because I wanted to, right? Is it just for the state to then come in and say that that transaction is illegal, that the seller is breaking the law, or I am breaking the law by choosing to patronize them? I consider it to be unjust. And this is the basis for, the argument against regulations and for economic freedom, right? Because as we mentioned earlier, if we were to compare someone who were to, open an actual brick and mortar store selling fat cakes and the lady on the streets, right? Outside of the overheads, of course, assuming that all the overheads are the same, that person will still have to spend an extra amount in terms of compliance, because compliance costs money, following certain directions that you would otherwise not follow. And we know that consumers will still patronize you if you did not follow them, because we have the street hawker lady who is not following any of those regulations and she still gets business. And this is the point, right? When you have more and more of these regulations that seek to regulate behavior that does not harm anyone, right? But they may be motivated by things like safety, just like these regulations, right? They're motivated by safety, they're motivated by health. But the thing is, who gets to decide what is safe, what is healthy for whom? Right, and this is the problem, particularly when it comes to something like, the marketplace, whereby we all have subjective valuations of what we consider important. So, as I said, in one instance, I considered one business to not be worthy of my patronage, and in another instance, I considered it to be worthy. So how do you create a uniform set of standards for everyone to follow if consumers are as whimsical as I have just described, right? It is impossible, and that is why we should err on the side of freedom as much as we can, unless, we have egregious instances or egregious cases. So that is the case against regulations, at the very least from my part, right? Because when you look at it from a bigger perspective, you start seeing the harms that, these laws that people have to comply with in order to operate their businesses create, right? The greatest example that shows this is the Economic Freedom of the World Index released by the Fraser Institute. And this is an index that measures the economic freedom in the world, and one of the components it uses to measure how free an economy is the amount of regulations that are there in that particular economy. And the trend is pretty much clear. When an economy has less regulations, it tends to grow much more bigger, and when an economy has more regulations, it doesn't tend to grow as much, right? And South Africa has been slipping throughout the years in that index, because we keep on, particularly in the field of regulations, right, hopping on more and more of these regulations under the guise of, trying to protect consumers or whatever the motivation may be. And even though those are noble aspirations or noble goals, I believe that as consumers, we should be willing to take charge of our lives, because this is why I love liberty. We should be willing to make decisions about our safety and our health ourselves, and not delegate them to the state. And of course, where the state does want to appropriate, that duty, it should be acutely aware that, for every regulation that you pass, particularly in, the productive sphere, you are creating an extra cost in terms of compliance, in terms of, that business owner having to understand that law. So even though they may not outsource that service, that is time that is spent understanding a law that in most cases has no bearing on the profitability of that particular business, right? So cumulatively, the things do add up. So even for the most ardent of, pro-government regulation proponents, I think we can understand this fact that if we can't, go for the uber idealistic format that I would prefer of having as minimal, if any, regulations in the economic sphere as possible, or rather having, actual zones that will not be subject to, certain regulations, and then having other zones outside of that geographic area that will still be subject to the same regulations that we see, right? So those are my solutions. But even if you are opposed to that, I think you can understand that there is a cost to regulation, and that cost is the productive capacity of whatever jurisdiction passes those regulations. And in South Africa, given that our economy is in the doldrums, and given the recent midterm budget speech, as we saw, we need not only revenue, we need growth. Or the best way for us to get revenue would be growth, and the best way to create growth is to free the economy. So free the economy. Let us decrease as many other regulations as we possibly can, right? Let us remove as many of them as we possibly can. And regulations, given their nature and that they are, are mostly passed by the executive, given from their powers that stem from legislation, it means that they can be changed relatively easy. They don't have to take a long process like something that a law would ordinarily take, right? So let us consider it. That is if we are interested in growing to what I know is our capacity and our potential. Now, please, as always, do tell us what you think below in the comments. Are you in favor of regulations? Do you think, we should have more? Do you think there's a balance to be struck, right? How should we strike that balance? How do we balance protecting our citizens whilst also not inhibiting economic activity too much? Tell us what you think, if you disagree, if you agree, and as always, stay free.